Welcome to Femme Fantasy, where transformation, elegance, and self-discovery come to life. I never thought it would start with something so small, so ordinary. The lace on her dresser, folded neatly into the softest curves of color I had ever dared to notice, called to me in ways I couldn't explain. I remember standing there, fingering the edge of a delicate white bra, its texture impossibly smooth under my fingers, and feeling an electric pulse of curiosity, something that seemed both forbidden and utterly natural. My heart pounded as I held it close to my chest, imagining the faint weight of it against skin I had only ever called mine in one way. I could hear the quiet hum of the apartment around me, the gentle tick of the wall clock, and I wondered if the world outside would even notice if I let myself explore this new reflection of who I might be. My fingers traced the seams, the tiny bow in the center, and I felt a shiver not of shame but of recognition, like a secret language had been whispered directly into my bones. The mirror in the corner caught my reflection, a face I knew and yet one that seemed suddenly unfamiliar, as if the person staring back could be someone else entirely, waiting for permission to step into the light. That night, I fell asleep holding it against my chest, as if holding it could hold me closer to some truth I didn't yet know how to name. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lingered in the bathroom longer than usual, the reflection in the mirror a constant companion, asking me questions I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to see myself as myself, but the edges felt wrong, the shadows too harsh. I wondered if it was the light or if it was me, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe it was something in between, something that didn't yet have a name, but made me feel alive. I began sneaking touches of the fabric, draping it over my shoulders when no one was watching, letting the soft lace brush against my skin. There was a vulnerability in it, a trembling sort of courage, and I realized I was learning to love the reflection of someone I hadn't allowed myself to become. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the warmth spreading across my chest, and I was dizzy with possibility, frightened, and exhilarated all at once. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to speak it aloud, not yet. Days passed, and the clothes became a ritual. I started small, just a scarf, a ribbon, the faintest touch of texture that felt like a secret signature. I would slip into the bathroom, close the door, and let the reflection guide me, shifting subtly until I could almost see her fully, this other me who had always existed in the spaces between my chest and my reflection. My fingers lingered on the soft lace, and I realized I wasn't just touching clothing, I was touching freedom, identity, a possibility I had denied myself for too long. Every layer of fabric I allowed myself to wear felt like peeling away a mask I had been born into and never chosen, and every fold and seam whispered permission. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and thrill, and I could almost hear her voice, my voice, soft and uncertain, but filled with longing. The mirror became my confidant, catching my hesitation and my small triumphs, and I began to see more than shapes and shadows. I began to see me. But then came the first time I saw someone else's eyes on me, a fleeting glance that turned my stomach to lead. In the reflection of the glass door of a cafe, I thought I had left the apartment behind, and yet here it was, staring back at me. The unmistakable sign that my secret life had weight, that it had consequences, that it existed beyond the intimacy of my room. I felt my knees weaken, my pulse quicken, and I realized for the first time that wanting to be seen and wanting to hide were tangled together in a way I couldn't untangle. The lace in my bag pressed against my side like a reminder that the transformation I had only begun in whispers and shadows was demanding to be real, even when the world outside didn't yet understand. That day, I walked home slowly, every step heavy with doubt, every step tinged with the smallest spark of pride, wondering what would happen if I let the next layer show. Back home, the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and my own lingering fear. I laid the garments on the bed and studied them, marveling at how ordinary they looked and yet how extraordinary they felt. I touched the soft fabric again and felt tears sting my eyes, a mixture of grief for the years I had ignored and hope for the years I might still have. I imagined her, me, wearing it fully, not just in stolen moments, but in the wide, steady daylight. I imagined the soft swish of fabric as I moved, the subtle reflection of lace against skin, the quiet thrill of existing fully, wholly, without apology. And in that imagining, I realized the mirror was no longer a boundary but a bridge, a door I had been afraid to open, and now the handle rested in my hand. That night, I held the bra again, resting it gently against my chest, listening to my own breathing and feeling the rhythm of something that was awakening inside me. I whispered a name I hadn't dared to speak before, soft and trembling, and it felt like the first brick laid in a path toward authenticity. I knew that once I crossed this line, there would be no going back to the simple reflection I had known, no retreat into the shadows of denial. I felt exhilaration and terror coiled together, a tightness in my chest that made me dizzy with anticipation. I placed the lace carefully back on the dresser, lingering for one final look in the mirror, and for the first time, I felt a sense of waiting that was not anxious, but expectant, as if the world was quietly leaning in to see me too. And in that stillness, I realized I had only begun to see the edges of who I could be, and that the next step would demand everything I had and everything I hoped to become. I could feel it in the way the morning light pooled across the bedroom floor, soft and patient, like it was waiting for me to arrive. I lingered in the doorway, heart hammering, the lace bra folded neatly in my hands. It felt heavier now, not with fabric but with meaning, with the weight of every unspoken thought I'd carried for years. I traced the delicate stitching with my thumb, imagining the warmth of it against skin that had long been confined to someone else's expectations. I realized that today, I didn't just want to touch the clothes. I wanted to inhabit them, to see what it felt like to move and breathe and exist in this new skin. My reflection in the mirror caught me unprepared, and for a moment, I recoiled, startled by the sight of someone both familiar and foreign. And then I laughed softly, a tremulous, shaky sound, because I recognized the truth. She was me, all along, waiting for permission. I dressed slowly, each layer a ritual of exploration. The lace felt alive under my fingertips, whispering against my chest and shoulders, reminding me of a tenderness I had long denied myself. I studied the mirror as I adjusted straps and ribbons, fascinated by the subtle shifts of shape, the soft contours that now reflected possibility. Every movement felt like poetry, like my body was translating years of hidden yearning into language that the world could almost understand, if only it knew how to look. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, as I turned, tilted my head, traced the line of my jaw. The mirror was no longer a passive surface. It was a confidant, a witness to the quiet revelation of who I had always been beneath the surface of expectation and fear. And yet, beneath the exhilaration, there was a knot of doubt, a flicker of shame, that whispered, "What if this is too much? What if this is wrong?" I tried to push it aside, letting my fingers linger over the soft lace that seemed to respond to my touch like a living thing. The sound of it brushing against skin, the faint swish as I moved, made me dizzy with anticipation and fear. I thought about the first time I had held it in secret, the trembling pulse of discovery, and I realized I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, without even knowing it. There was a thrill in the vulnerability, a rush in admitting to myself that I wanted this, that I needed this. The mirror reflected a quiet courage forming in my eyes, a fragile sort of bravery, and I realized that the transformation wasn't just about appearance, it was about claiming the small, honest pieces of myself that had always been suppressed. I left the apartment that day with the lace hidden beneath a loose sweater, but I carried it in a way that changed the rhythm of my steps. Every reflection caught on shop windows, every brief flash of glass or chrome, drew my gaze, and I could see her there, in fragments, soft shoulders, the subtle curve of a chest, a face that was beginning to look more like the one I had imagined in dreams. I felt raw, exposed, yet exhilarated, like I was walking a tightrope between fear and freedom. The city hummed around me, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place within a single human body, and yet every sound, every brush of wind, felt amplified, resonating with possibility. The faint rustle of fabric against fabric, The whisper of lace beneath my sweater became a symphony of identity that no one else could hear, but that filled me with an ineffable, trembling joy. That evening, I returned home and stood before the mirror once more, letting the sweater slide from my shoulders. The lace beneath caught the light, delicate and daring, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I studied myself in silence, feeling both the thrill of recognition and the ache of uncertainty. Could I step fully into this version of me? Could I inhabit her without apology, without fear of judgment? The reflection seemed to pulse with possibility, as though it was waiting for me to decide, and I realized that this was a choice I had to make alone, quietly, with nothing but my own heartbeat as witness. The mirror held me in its gaze, unwavering, patient, and I felt the weight of years of denial pressing against my chest, mingling with a strange, new exhilaration. I began to experiment with small gestures, subtle shifts in posture, the tilt of my head, the way I let my fingers brush against the lace. It was terrifying and intoxicating, each movement a declaration, each glance in the mirror a step further along a path I had only glimpsed in fragments. The sound of the fabric brushing against my skin became a rhythm, a heartbeat that matched my own, and I realized that for the first time, I was beginning to know the shape of my truth. And yet, in the quiet of the room, with the city murmuring beyond the window, a whisper of doubt lingered. If someone saw me like this, really saw me, would they understand? Or would they only see the mask I had been forced to wear for so long? I placed the bra back on the dresser, lingering over it as though saying goodbye to the old me, to the fear, to the secrecy, and I felt a tremor of anticipation for what would come next. I knew that each day would demand more courage, that each reflection would test the fragile confidence I was building. And as I stood there, staring at my reflection, I realized the first step had been taken, but the journey was only beginning, and I wasn't sure if the world, or even I, was ready for the next transformation. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in that night, the soft glow of the lamp painting everything in muted golds and ambers. I stood before the mirror, tracing the lines of my face with a trembling hand, as if mapping a landscape I had only ever glimpsed in dreams. The lace lay across the bed, innocent and potent, a symbol of a version of myself I had never allowed to breathe. My heartbeat felt loud in the quiet, a staccato rhythm echoing in my chest as I imagined the soft contours of who I could become. I wanted to reach for her fully, not just in stolen fragments or shadows, but with the certainty of someone claiming their own reflection. And yet, fear tugged at my spine, whispering that the world outside would never understand, that even I might falter in this light. I tried to move past the fear, lifting the delicate garment and slipping it over my shoulders. The sensation was electric, intimate, almost sacred. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for a moment, the reflection seemed to flicker, as if the person staring back was deciding whether or not to exist. I straightened, feeling the lace pressed gently against my chest, the soft ribbon tickling my skin, and I realized I was trembling not from cold or nerves, but from the exhilaration of authenticity. Every breath felt like a confession, every heartbeat a small victory. The room smelled faintly of lavender and fabric softener, ordinary scents that suddenly felt suffused with the weight of transformation. I lingered there, letting my gaze travel over every curve, every line, until I began to see her fully, the version of me I had been chasing through shadows for so long. The next morning, I awoke with a restless energy, a hum of anticipation that made my skin feel alive. I dressed carefully, letting the bra guide the contours of a sweater, letting the texture of lace beneath influence the tilt of my shoulders. Each movement was deliberate, a quiet choreography of becoming. The mirror caught me in fleeting angles, her chin lifted slightly, fingers brushing the fabric, eyes softened with wonder. I realized that transformation wasn't just about appearance. It was about reclaiming something I had lost, or perhaps had never truly known. I felt a strange blend of fear and serenity, the way one might feel standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the leap would be terrifying, but also liberating. I decided to venture out that day in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. I wore the lace beneath a loose blouse, a scarf draped lightly around my neck. Each reflection in the shop windows and passing cars felt like a test, a dialogue between the self I had always presented and the self I was beginning to inhabit. I noticed the small things. The way the lace caught the light when I moved, the soft brush of fabric against my wrists, the way my posture shifted almost imperceptibly. There was an intimate tension in every glance I caught, a sense that even if the world didn't see me fully, I could see myself, and that alone was enough to ignite a thrill that both frightened and exhilarated me. That evening, I returned home and stood before the mirror for a long, unbroken moment. The room was hushed, the faint tick of the clock the only sound besides my own breathing. I let my hands trace the edges of the lace, letting each thread anchor me to a reality that was both terrifying and beautiful. I whispered a name I had adopted in my private moments, soft and trembling, and it felt like planting a flag, claiming territory that had long been denied. The reflection seemed to pulse with possibility, and I realized that each day would require courage, each glance a small act of defiance, each movement a step toward completeness. And in that quiet, golden light, I understood that the journey wasn't linear. It was a winding path, each choice echoing into the next, each decision a doorway I could either step through or turn away from. Then came the moment I didn't anticipate, a sound, a creak on the stairs, the faintest brush of someone else's presence. My heart jumped, and I froze, half in fear, half in exhilaration. The lace felt suddenly heavier, as if it carried not just the promise of transformation, but the weight of being seen, of potentially being understood or misunderstood. I held my breath, my hands stilling over the delicate fabric, and felt the ache of longing mix with the thrill of becoming. The reflection in the mirror seemed to lean in, almost urging me forward, and I realized that the next step, stepping fully into who I was meant to be, was no longer something I could delay. The world outside the apartment waited, impatient and unknowable, and I was poised at the threshold, trembling with the gravity of everything I wanted and feared. The days that followed were both thrilling and terrifying, a delicate dance between hiding and becoming. I began to experiment more boldly, letting the lace show just a hint beneath blouses, letting the soft fabric brush against my skin in ways that made me catch my breath. Every morning, I lingered longer in front of the mirror, tracing my jawline, tilting my head, adjusting the delicate folds of fabric until they felt like extensions of my own body. Each reflection taught me something new, the curve of a shoulder, the gentle slope of a collarbone, the way my hands moved differently when I imagined myself fully as her. I started to notice subtler things, too. The way sunlight pooled across my chest in the morning, the slight hum of fabric against skin as I moved, the way my voice softened when I whispered her name in private. It was intoxicating, but it was also exhausting. Each day demanded courage I hadn't realized I possessed. I started to keep a small notebook by the dresser, a quiet confession of thoughts I couldn't yet speak aloud. I wrote about the small victories, adjusting the lace just so, catching my reflection in a passing window and feeling a spark of recognition, and also the doubts that haunted me. What if I was wrong? What if I'd imagined this courage? What if the world refused to see me? The pen became a mirror of its own, a space where my fears and desires could coexist, without judgment. Some nights I read my words aloud, letting the sound of my own voice affirm the truth I had carried silently for so long. The act of naming her, of speaking her into existence, began to change me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The mirror in the corner of the room was no longer just glass. It was a portal, a witness to a slow, profound revelation. Then came the first real test, a day when stepping outside felt like stepping into another universe. I wore the lace beneath a soft cardigan, my hair brushed in a way that framed my face differently, and I walked into the bustling streets with a nervous exhilaration that made my stomach twist. Each reflection in the shop windows made me flinch and then smile. Every passerby was oblivious, yet each glance in the glass allowed me to see her more clearly. The city felt suddenly alive in a way it never had before, as if it recognized my transformation even when others could not. I was aware of every sound, every shift of light, every breath I took, and yet it was neither shameful nor reckless. It was simply me, emerging in layers I had long denied. That evening, I returned home and allowed myself a longer, more deliberate inspection in the mirror. I let the lace rest against my skin as I ran my fingers along the seams, appreciating the texture, the softness, the subtle way it moved with me. I marveled at the reflection, seeing not just her form but the courage etched into every line of my posture, every curve of my silhouette. I began to feel a kind of reverence for the process, and understanding that transformation was less about instant recognition and more about the quiet accumulation of moments, small choices that gradually revealed the truth beneath. My hands lingered over the fabric, tracing the tiny bow at its center, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest, a mixture of pride, relief, and wonder. And then the quietest moment startled me. The apartment door clicked, footsteps echoed faintly, and I froze, fabric in hand, heart thudding so loudly I was certain it would betray me. For a second, I imagined being caught, the veil of secrecy pulled away, the fragile confidence shattered. But when the footsteps receded, I realized something important. The fear of being seen was not the same as the inability to be myself. My reflection smiled faintly back, a reassurance that even in uncertainty, even in hesitation, I could claim this space, these layers, this identity that had always existed. It was a fragile victory, yes, but a victory nonetheless. That night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, the lace folded beside me, notebook open, candle flickering softly. I wrote her name again, tracing the letters slowly, savoring the sound of it on my tongue, and I realized that naming her was more than an act of imagination. It was an act of creation. The room felt sacred, every shadow and light a companion to the quiet revolution happening within me. And as I finally leaned back against the wall, letting the soft hum of the city seep through the window, I knew that the next steps would be harder, more public, more irreversible, but I also knew I couldn't turn back. Something inside me had awoken, delicate and trembling, and it demanded to live. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the floor in a way that made the apartment feel almost sacred, as if it had been waiting for me to rise. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, tracing the lines of my face with trembling fingers, listening to the faint rustle of fabric beneath my hands. The lace bra rested lightly against my chest, a constant, intimate reminder of the version of myself I had been nurturing in secret. I noticed small shifts in my reflection, the subtle curve of my shoulders, the way my collarbones caught the light, the softness in my eyes that had never been there before. Each detail was a revelation, a quiet acknowledgement that the person staring back was not a mask, not a fantasy, but a version of me finally being allowed to exist. My breath caught as I whispered her name, barely audible, and the sound felt like a fragile lifeline threading through my chest. I decided to push the boundaries a little further that day. I tried on a skirt I had never dared to wear, letting it fall around my legs and sway with every movement. The sensation of the fabric brushing against my thighs was dizzying, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt like truth, like my body was finally aligned with my inner self. I studied my reflection obsessively, tilting my head, adjusting the hem, letting my fingers trace the textures I had only imagined before. Every movement was a declaration, subtle but profound, and each glance in the mirror deepened the sense that I was stepping closer to someone I had always wanted to be. And yet, alongside the exhilaration, a quiet fear remained, whispering that this truth was fragile, that exposure could shatter it in an instant. When I ventured outside, the world felt simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. The wind caught the skirt just so, the sunlight highlighted the soft lace beneath my blouse, and every reflection, from store windows to car mirrors, offered a fleeting confirmation of my becoming. I noticed the smallest details, the sway of my hips, the tilt of my shoulders, the rhythm of my steps. Each was a note in a symphony I was composing for myself, a melody of identity that had been silenced for too long. There was a tension in the air, an awareness that I was being observed even when I wasn't, that the world might not understand, but that I was no longer hiding. And with each step, the reflection in the glass seemed to smile back at me, urging me forward, encouraging me to inhabit this version of myself fully. That evening, I returned home with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. I stood in front of the mirror for what felt like hours, letting the skirt fall into pleats, the lace settle against my chest, the soft light of the lamp warm against my skin. I marveled at the reflection, feeling a quiet reverence for the layers of identity I had been slowly uncovering. I whispered her name again, this time with a steadiness I hadn't known before, and it felt like claiming territory I had never dared to explore. The mirror had become more than glass. It was a witness, a keeper of my courage, reflecting not just my appearance, but the transformation of my heart. But then came the first moment of doubt I couldn't shake, a fleeting thought of anyone, seeing me in this form and rejecting me, the fear of misunderstanding coiling tight in my chest. I gripped the edge of the dresser, lace trembling beneath my fingertips, and realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. The reflection seemed to nod back at me, patient and unwavering, as if to say that fear was a companion, not an enemy, and that every choice I made from this point on would define not only how the world saw me, but how I saw myself. As night fell, I folded the lace carefully, placing it next to my notebook, and allowed myself a moment to breathe fully, to let the quiet hum of transformation settle into my bones. I realized that the next step would require even more visibility, vulnerability, authenticity in spaces that had always demanded conformity. And as I stared at my reflection one last time before turning off the light, I knew that the journey was no longer about secret moments or stolen glimpses. It was about stepping into the world fully as her, and I was both terrified and exhilarated to take that step tomorrow. The next morning felt different, almost electric. The sunlight hit the apartment at a sharper angle, cutting across the floor in long, golden streaks, and I realized I could no longer pretend this was just a private experiment. Standing before the mirror, I studied the reflection, tracing the subtle lines of her face, the gentle slope of my shoulders, the curve of my chest beneath the lace. Each detail seemed to hum with a quiet insistence. You are here. You have always been here. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the straps, smoothing the fabric over skin that was simultaneously unfamiliar and intimately mine. I whispered her name again, this time with a sense of authority, and it felt like a small exhale of courage I hadn't known I possessed. I decided it was time to see how it felt to occupy public spaces, even if only briefly. I dressed carefully, letting the lace and fabric guide subtle choices in posture and movement, each step a quiet rehearsal of becoming. The mirror caught me in fleeting angles, a hand brushing against my thigh, a shoulder tilting just so, a tilt of the chin that conveyed more than words could. I left the apartment slowly, each step weighted with anticipation, and felt the city respond in its indifferent, sprawling way. Shop windows reflected fragments of me back in unexpected ways, a passing glance caught in glass, a silhouette framed in sunlight, and each glimpse reinforced the sense that I was moving through the world not as an imposter, but as someone claiming her space. The experience was both exhilarating and frightening. I noticed every detail, the brush of fabric against my skin, the sway of my hips, the quiet rhythm of my breathing. The wind lifted strands of hair across my face, and I caught myself in a car mirror, startled by the person I saw, yet undeniably drawn to her. The lace beneath my sweater felt like a secret promise, a tether to a self I had been nurturing in shadows, and yet each reflection, each accidental confirmation, emboldened me to hold my head a little higher, to let my movements reflect the truth I had been keeping silent. There was a constant tension, the simultaneous thrill of visibility and the fear of exposure, and it exhilarated me in ways I could hardly name. Returning home, I lingered in front of the mirror longer than ever, adjusting the fabric, feeling the contours of her shape settle naturally against me. I marveled at the reflection, noticing subtle changes, the softness in my eyes, the confident tilt of my shoulders, the delicate strength in the lines of my hands. I whispered her name softly, reverently, and for the first time felt a quiet, unshakable connection to the person I had been nurturing in secret. The mirror no longer reflected a version of me that might be. It reflected someone who existed fully, here and now. And yet, in the stillness of the apartment, fear crept in like a shadow at the edges of the light. What if this courage faltered in the face of others? What if the world refused to see her the way I did? My hands lingered over the lace, tracing the small bow at its center, and I realized that transformation was no longer just about fabric or reflection. It was about claiming my identity in the presence of a world that might not understand. The thought made my chest tighten, my breath catch, but also filled me with a strange, exhilarating resolve. The journey could not be paused or hidden any longer. That night, I wrote in my notebook by candlelight, detailing every feeling, every small victory, every moment of doubt and wonder. I described the sway of fabric, the warmth of lace against skin, the subtle shifts in posture, and each word felt like a brick in the foundation of her existence. The room hummed with quiet reverence, the soft flicker of candlelight tracing shadows that seemed to lean in, attentive to my confession. And as I finally folded the lace carefully, placing it beside the notebook, I knew the next step would demand everything: visibility, authenticity, vulnerability in spaces that had long demanded conformity. My reflection in the darkened glass of the window stared back, patient, unwavering, almost urging me forward, and I realized that tomorrow would be the day I could no longer hide in fragments. The next morning, I woke with a restlessness that made my chest ache, a quiet insistence vibrating through my bones. The apartment was bathed in soft, gray light, the kind that makes shadows stretch and linger like memories. I stood in front of the mirror and studied her, the reflection that had become more real to me with every passing day. Her eyes, softened yet alert, held a confidence I hadn't seen in myself before. My fingers traced the lace bra against my chest, over the small bow that had become a symbol of this fragile, unfolding truth. It was both ordinary and miraculous, a simple piece of fabric transformed into a vessel of courage. I whispered her name again, feeling it roll off my tongue, not as a secret, but as a declaration. I dressed slowly, deliberately. The lace beneath my blouse, the skirt swaying gently around my legs, even the tilt of my chin in the mirror, all were orchestrated in silent reverence for the person I was becoming. Today, I decided I would take another step into visibility, to walk not just as a shadow of her, but as someone claiming her existence in a public world. My reflection watched me, patient and unjudging, and I felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. The air around me seemed charged with possibility, each sound and scent amplified, each movement weighted with the delicate gravity of identity. Stepping outside, I was struck by the ordinary intimacy of the world, the wind brushing against my skin, the distant hum of traffic, the soft echo of my shoes against the sidewalk. Every reflection, store windows, parked cars, the mirrored glass of office buildings, caught me in fragments, and each glimpse was a quiet affirmation. I noticed subtle things, the way my skirt swayed, the lace beneath just peeking, the sway of my shoulders, the soft curve of my fingers as I brushed hair away from my face. Each reflection was a conversation between who I had been and who I was becoming. The city itself seemed both vast and intimate, indifferent yet attuned to the quiet courage emanating from my steps. By evening, I returned home, heart still thrumming with the energy of the day. I stood before the mirror, letting the fabric settle, letting the reflection breathe with me. The lace and skirt, once objects of secret fascination, now felt like extensions of my being. I turned slightly, examined every angle, and whispered her name with reverence, as if invoking not just an identity, but a promise to honor her fully. The mirror reflected not only my appearance, but the quiet victories of courage, the subtle reclamation of self, and I felt a deep, almost sacred satisfaction. But then the shadow of doubt crept in, as it always did. What if someone saw me tomorrow and refused to recognize her? What if the delicate scaffolding of confidence I had built cracked under scrutiny? My fingers lingered on the lace, tracing the tiny bow, and I realized that transformation was not just about the clothes, the reflection, or the way I moved. It was about carrying her into a world that might not understand, about asserting her existence even in the face of fear. The thought made my chest tighten, yet beneath it was a strange, luminous hope. That night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, candle flickering softly beside my notebook, and wrote with deliberate slowness. I captured the rhythm of the fabric against my skin, the quiet sway of the skirt, the subtle curves that now defined her form. I wrote her name over and over, tracing it like a lifeline, letting it settle into the fibers of my being. And as I finally folded the lace and set it beside the notebook, I understood something profound. The journey could not be paused, the reflection could not be ignored, and tomorrow I would step into the world not in fragments, but whole. The mirror's reflection caught me one last time that night, eyes steady, posture unwavering, and I felt a tremor of anticipation so sharp it seemed to vibrate through the apartment. I knew the next day would not just test courage, it would demand surrender, full and uncompromising, to a version of myself I had been nurturing in secret. And as the candle guttered and shadows deepened, I realized that crossing that threshold would change everything. Morning came differently that day, as if the sunlight itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. It filtered through the curtains in long, golden ribbons, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the quiet apartment. I stood before the mirror, barefoot, heart hammering, the lace bra and skirt laid neatly across the bed like sacred artifacts. I touched them lightly, letting my fingers trace the familiar texture, and for the first time, I didn't hesitate. No longer a secret, no longer a fragment. I would wear her fully, here and now. My reflection held me in its steady gaze, patient, unwavering, waiting for the choice I was finally ready to make. I whispered her name aloud, strong this time, resonant, and the sound vibrated through me, a declaration as tangible as the morning light. I dressed slowly, deliberately, savoring every sensation, the soft brush of lace against my chest, the gentle sway of the skirt, the subtle way the fabric moved as I shifted. Each motion was a reaffirmation of who I was, a quiet but unwavering commitment to exist fully in this form. The mirror reflected more than clothing. It reflected courage, honesty, and the profound intimacy of embracing oneself. I adjusted my hair, tilting my head just so, feeling the reflection breathe with me. Every small detail, the curve of my shoulders, the softness of my hands, the tilt of my chin, became a ritual, a choreography of authenticity that I had longed for without fully realizing it. Stepping outside, the world felt both vast and immediate. The wind lifted the skirt slightly, teasing, reminding me of presence and visibility. Each reflection in the windows and mirrors along the street caught me in fragments, and with each, I felt a flicker of recognition and validation. I was being seen, in small ways, by my own eyes first, and that alone was enough to steady me. The city hummed around me, indifferent yet strangely intimate, every sound amplified, every brush of fabric against my skin a reminder that I was no longer hiding. There was fear, yes, a tight coil in my stomach, but it mingled with a luminous exhilaration, a sense of belonging to my own body and identity in a way that was utterly new. By evening, I returned home, exhausted but elated. I stood before the mirror, letting the skirt fall naturally, the lace settle softly, tracing the contours of her form with reverent fingers. I whispered her name again, softly, steadily, and for the first time it felt like a promise fulfilled rather than a wish. The mirror reflected someone whole, someone unafraid, someone who had crossed thresholds I had long only imagined. And yet, beneath the triumph, a quiet awareness lingered. The journey would not end here. Life would challenge this version of me in ways I couldn't yet know, but I was ready to meet it fully. That night, I wrote in my notebook, each word deliberate, each phrase a testament to the path I had traveled. I documented every sensation, every reflection, every fleeting doubt and small victory. The candlelight flickered across the pages, casting shadows that seemed to lean closer, attentive to my confession. The lace lay beside me, no longer just fabric, but a talisman of identity and courage. And as I finally closed the notebook and looked at my reflection one last time before sleep, I felt a profound peace settle into my bones. I had crossed the threshold from curiosity to authenticity, from fragment to whole, from shadow to light. In that quiet moment, I understood something deep and irreversible. Becoming her was not a single act, not a costume, not a secret. It was a lifetime's journey of discovery, and I had taken the first full steps into a life where my reflection no longer frightened me, but embraced me. The mirror held me steady, and I realized that she would walk with me, always, quietly, courageously, wholly. And for the first time in my life, I was ready for the world to see her.